Governance of Network Rail. Mark Reckless.
Thank you, Chairman. Network Rail has a quite extraordinary governance structure. It was set up in that way. I think almost all parties would agree, with the primary aim of keeping its debt off the government's books. However, since a ruling from Eurostat, implemented by a National Statistics Office here, that debt is now on the government's balance sheet. That decision having been taken finally in December 2013, and the reclassification of the entity taking effect on the 1st of September, I believe, 2014. Now, last week when I asked the Secretary of State whether it wasn't therefore time to reform Network Rail's labyrinth governance structure to make it more accountable, the Secretary of State replied that he would take my question as a representation to cancel the building of a new railway station in my constituency. I fear that exchange probably told us more about the character of the Secretary of State than it did about the governance of Network Rail. Hence today's debate, which also follows publication yesterday of Network Rail's report into the post-Christmas disruption. I would like to sort of focus my remarks on two issues, pay and governance, before finally saying one or two remarks about Rochester and the applicability of these issues within my constituency. Now, yesterday we had published a report by Dr. Francis, let's get the spelling of his name correct, Dr. Francis Payanessa, who is the Managing Director of Infrastructure Projects at Network Rail. He is paid an annual salary of £425,000, with a further bonus, quote, opportunity of 20% of salary. Now, I intend no personal criticism to Dr. Francis Payanessa. He's clearly a manager of stature. Prior to his current role with Network Rail, he was the UK Managing Director of Bombardier, and under his leadership, Bombardier secured the very important Crossrail contract for building trains, having previously lost out on, I believe, the Thameslink contract to Siemens. Clearly, running leading infrastructure projects require a different set of skills, given their complexity. But he replaced Simon Kirby, who moved on to head up HS2 Limited as chief executive. Clearly a huge, at least potential job. But it's the excessive cost structure in the rail industry, led by Network Rail, which underlines my party's belief that HS2 is unaffordable. Now, half a dozen people at Network Rail, at least, earn similar sums to Dr. Francis Payanessa, and Mark Carney, the chief executive, earns substantially more. Now, what I would like to know is why has their pay not been cut to reflect the transfer of Network Rail as an organisation from the private to the public sector? We talk often as a comparator of how much the sort of Prime Minister earns, but the numbers of people sort of earning in excess of the Prime Minister's salary are quite legion within Network Rail. And it's moved from being a private sector to a public sector sort of organisation. And surely we should be told what new standards are being applied in Network Rail, sort of following that move. In March 2012, the department wrote, as a private sector company, Network Rail sets performance pay levels for its senior staff. But it no longer is a private sector company. So who is setting those pay and performance-related pay numbers now? Who are those senior managers accountable to for their pay? Is it the Secretary of State? Is it the so-called members of Network Rail, about which more in a moment? Or is it themselves? Mark Carney has made an announcement, I believe, that he intends to sort of limit his bonus this year to just 5%, he says, of his salary. Of course, that bonus will still be more than average earnings across the country and in my constituency. And I think particularly having seen the failures over the post-Christmas period and the disruption that caused to many people across the country seeking to use the network, the extent to which it has become standard just to have this long-running periods of shutdown over Christmas and New Year, the length of some of these infrastructure projects and the closures involved, the lack of predictability about them. One thing, though, my constituency, we greatly welcome the new railway station in Rochester. One point I do have from constituents is why can't people be warned longer in advance when there are going to be closures so that they can plan around them? I will give way.
On that very, I'm grateful, Mr. Crosby. On that very point about the disruption, giving notice in advance, the Network Rail had years to prepare for the shutdown of London Bridge Station over the recent Christmas period as part of the admirable Thameslink programme. But the huge blunder they made in organising that, the effects of which have still not been concluded, and people's journeys are still being disrupted. It's not bonuses that the managers should be looking at, it's fines.
The Honourable Member makes a good point, and I think it comes back to this issue of how are these people held accountable, and whether it is the withholding of a bonus or some other form of discipline, perhaps a reduction in salary, or whether we're talking about fines, whether on a sort of regulatory, I'm not sure if the Honourable Gentleman is suggesting perhaps not a sort of criminal basis, but whatever would be very, very strong for a management role like this. And what my constituents, I think, here want to see is accountability. And we simply do not have that with the current structure. Now, we have, from the 1st of September 2014, we have a new agreement between the department and Network Rail. But there is, I believe at least, a lack of clarity about what difference that agreement is making in how Network Rail is held to account. And why do we still have these 46 sort of public members and a similar number of industry members ostensibly playing a part akin to shareholders in this organisation? We had a vote back, I believe, in November 2009, and those members, I don't know whether turkeys voting for Christmas is a fair comparison here or not, but 36 of them voted to decrease their numbers, but 36 voted against decreasing their numbers. And that has remained the situation ever since, despite the government saying again in March 2012 that we therefore welcome the governance proposals that Network Rail is announcing, including reducing the number of members to a more sensible level, therefore improving the quality of decision making. I mean, has that happened? In the same report, Reforming Our Railways, Putting the Customers First, the government says, Network Rail is a private sector, not for dividend company, limited by guarantee. We believe the existing structure is capable of delivering the outcomes and the savings we need without disruptive and unnecessary organisational change. Equity is a strong driver of efficiency and value for money. But how in this unique, convoluted, labyrinth governance structure does equity operate as a driver of efficiency? We have these industry members that the board reports to a degree, and you might think it's useful perhaps to have that reporting line to the customer. But whenever those customers' interests are involved, that member steps aside on the basis of there being a conflict of interest. So how can that sort of governance structure work? And is it really a sensible way for us to proceed? In my own constituency of Rochester and Strood, we have had the impact of the London Bridge changes, and the disruption has affected some people. And the sheer length of the closure of London Bridge for Charing Cross bound trains that we currently have is enormous. And we have to hold Network Rail to account for the costs that it applies, which largely get passed on as fares to the customer, but also to the length of time these projects take. And I would be interested in the Minister's view and telling us what she's done to make sure that that closure period, as well as the costs, are as low as possible. And I just have an innate suspicion of an organisation which is not accountable, or at least not in a way that I can understand, or a way in which other organisations are. The Minister will no doubt refer to this report published yesterday by Dr. Francis Pernessa, explaining away, defending, to an extent, sort of putting their side of the story in terms of the disruption we saw immediately after Christmas. But this report isn't addressed to anyone. I mean, I don't know. Is this something that's for the board of Network Rail? Is it for its members? Is it for the Secretary of State? Is it for Parliament? It doesn't say. There's a foreword from Mark Carney, and there's a whole series of explanations and, to some extent, excuses. But who ultimately holds Network Rail to account for this? Why are they being paid so much money? Why is this disruption allowed? And do we really believe that this labyrinth governance sort of structure and the sort of costs we see in this industry are the best we can do? I believe that this country can do this better, and it's time we got on with that and actually dealt with some of the governance issues at Networks Rail and made sure it worked better.
It's not in order, Mr. Carswell, for a member to speak in an additional member to speak in a half-hour debate unless they've secured the agreement of both the sponsoring member and the Minister. Has that advance agreement been secured?
The Honourable Member spoke to me yesterday, and I spoke with the Minister, and I understand that agreement is forthcoming from her as well as from myself.
Is that agreed? Douglas Carswell.
I'm most grateful, Mr. Crosby. I think we have a serious problem with Network Rail. Certainly, the Clacton line that affects my constituency has seen overrunning weekend works that have been very disruptive to commuters trying to get to work on Monday mornings. This has happened several times. We routinely have problems and failures on the line, and we have seen a lot of weekend closures. That's not very helpful if you're talking about a seaside town that depends upon a lot of weekend seaside tourists coming to visit it. We've also seen the problems affecting London stations over Christmas. Now, my main concern is not so much the rail operators, although I think that in the case of Abellio, they've been insufficiently robust in dealing with their supplier, Network Rail. My main concern is with Network Rail. It is, to all intents and purposes, a public body that has recourse to public funds, to socialised costs, and yet doesn't seem to be accountable to the public. It seems to have the structure of a public quango, but the bonuses of a bank. What is fundamentally missing is accountability. Now, I wrote to the Secretary of State before Christmas in a letter asking if there were any plans to revisit the governance structure of Network Rail, because it's not working the way it should, and when errors happen, they're not being corrected the way they should be. I got a response that I think was probably drafted, if I can put this kindly, by a private secretary who didn't understand the question. I then raised it on the floor of the House last week, and I got a response from the Secretary of State that was perhaps dismissive, perhaps contemptuous, but you know, we're not running a whip's office anymore. These are grown-up questions that demand proper, considered, grown-up answers. There needs to be a rethink of this organisation's governance structure. Now, I would be interested to hear if the Minister has given serious thought to how we might change the governance structure of Network Rail. My own suggestion would be that we would have greater accountability to Parliament. We could perhaps have a role for the Transport Select Committee. Perhaps the Transport Select Committee could confirm the appointment of senior management to this body. Perhaps this body might appear annually before the Select Committee to appeal for its budget. I don't claim to have all the answers. What I know is that the status quo is not working, there's a lack of accountability, and we need real reform. I would love to hear from the Minister how we can do that. How can we ensure there's real accountability? With pleasure.
I mean, the government said in March 2012 that Network Rail will invite other companies to compete against its core business. That sort of contestability is one way, potentially, of bringing market disciplines to the operator. In the same document, the government was saying that we could have sort of vertical integration between operators, perhaps in an area like Kent, where we have South Eastern as the main sort of operator. They could work more closely together, or even become an alliance or a single body. And I just wonder, why is this not taking forward? Has Honourable Friend any insights?
I think the suggestion you make is a good one. There are all sorts of different models of accountability. There's the proposal for parliamentary accountability, the proposal for restructuring in the way that you suggest it should give greater accountability. My fear is that we may have spent longer this afternoon discussing new models of corporate governance in this chamber than the Minister might have done in the department over the years. I would like to hear from the Minister what specific thoughts does she have about changes to the structure of Network's accountability and governance structure. Network Rail is a corporatist organisation. It is it lacks accountability. Now, to people who try to do the right thing, but who have to travel by rail, have to buy season tickets, have to travel on the railway to get to work, they find that the fares go up, but the level of service remains poor. Ordinary people feel this incredible sense of frustration that for all that they do and all that they're forced to do, the people at the top of Network Rail don't seem to be held accountable for mistakes that their organisation makes. Now, we often hear ministers in this place talking about accountability to Parliament through the Minister. I would suggest that that model of accountability isn't working, and we need a fundamentally different way of making sure that Network Rail is properly, publicly accountable. I'd love to hear it.
I'm just very slightly concerned about voting. Shall I get started? And if we have to see how it goes. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today. I'm delighted to actually have the opportunity to respond to this debate. I do congratulate the Honourable Member for Rochester and Stroud on securing the debate. This is a really important issue, and both he and his colleague were right to raise this issue on the floor of the House last week. I'm sure his constituents will also be delighted with his newfound interest in the railways. It did strike me in digging that before last week he had only made 2 mentions of his trains in this Parliament. One was to express his very profound support for HS2 and what it would do for his constituency, and one was to talk quite rightly about the inexcusable fact that constituents on his franchise were paying RPI +3, a policy that this government has ended. Of course.
I'm grateful. I think that the government's ending of that RPI +3 guinea pig to RPI +1, and now our RPI is a positive thing, which I very strongly welcome. Can I ask the Minister, did she consult her right honourable friend for Chipping Barnett in terms of the many discussions I had with her about the railways?
No, I did not. I'm afraid I relied on the public record, as I think is important to do. His honourable friend from Clacton, of course, in fact, has spoken more in the last week on the railways than he's done in the entirety of this Parliament, because I can find no record in the public discourse.
I intend to suspend the sitting for a maximum of 15 minutes, but if members are back in time, then we'll reconvene earlier. Order. Reconvene committee. We have an extra 30 minutes. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. As I was saying, I'm sure the Honourable Gentleman for Clacton and his constituents are delighted that he has finally spoken up on railways, because my little trawl suggested he had actually made no mentions of railways in this Parliament. A pleasure.
At the time, I was, of course, a Conservative Member of Parliament, and I was bound by the whip, and she and her boss in the Transport Department were, of course, running the Whip's office, and it was therefore much more difficult for me to speak freely in the interest of my constituents, something I'm now at liberty to do so. I'm grateful to
Well, the Honourable Gentleman suggests that he could not have asked questions about fares, services, refurbishment of his stations. He did manage to have 42 mentions of the EU, and in fact it is rather depressing that his last comment on the railways actually dates from 7.5 years ago. He could presumably have spoken in that Parliament. No matter. I am delighted to welcome this nascent and newfound interest in the railways. It does, of course, cause questions to me. I'd be interested to know what the party policy is, because of UKIP's manifesto in 2010, of course, called for 3 high-speed lines, not 2, with no mention of cost control. However, we will leave that point and move on. I propose to make 3 sets of remarks this afternoon, Mr. Crosbie. The first is to just canter through the current governance structure of Network Rail and perhaps correct or at least answer some of the questions the honourable gentleman for Rochester raised. Secondly, ask the question, is there any evidence of governance failure? And lastly, provide a review of recent events where I think there are some very valid questions we all need to be asking. As the honourable gentleman know, in December 2013, the ONS decided to make an independent decision to classify the Network Rail balance sheet from the private to the public sector. This actually changes nothing in terms of operational performance. It is quite rightly an attempt to put public debt on the public balance sheet, something that I strongly support. It doesn't change the industry structure, the day-to-day operations of the rail network, and it has no effect on fares, performance, punctuality, safety or timetable. If I could just make a little progress, it would be helpful. What it does do, though, I think, is rightly raise the question in government as to what should our governance look like, which is why the framework agreement was published back in September that set out quite specifically what the relationship between Network Rail and the DfT looks like. I think trying to achieve two things. One is to achieve a level of operational independence. All political parties, including the honourable gentlemen, I'm sure, would say that ministers should not be running trains. There should be an element of independence, there should be an element of control. The honourable gentleman is jumping away from a sedentary position. I am trying to answer some of the questions. I know he's not particularly interested in railways, but perhaps after today he might be. It is not appropriate in many people's view, including his parties, to have ministers and indeed officials running the railway network. It is appropriate that Network Rail operates at an arm's length body. However, what it is important to deliver is accountability and correct governance and structure. The Secretary of State, now under the new framework agreement, has particular levers as a special board member to steer Network Rail, including the right to agree business plans and to approve Network Rail's remuneration envelope. The honourable gentleman raised questions about specific questions. Yes, of course.
Mark Reckless.
Didn't he previously have those powers as a special member, and are those not powers due to him under the Articles of Association of Network Rail rather than under the framework agreement?
I think the issue is
Minister.
more, have they been exercised? And indeed, since this new structure, they have indeed been exercised. The department representing the Secretary of State have started to do appropriate things like attend AGMs to be involved in board meetings. Let me just make a little more progress, because he did raise a lot of questions. In extreme cases, the Secretary of State has the power to remove the chair or indeed to become the sole member of Network Rail. So what is the role? So in my view, in the view of the department, the Minister, the Secretary of State, determines the rail investment strategy and the statements of funding available, crucially, and works with the ORR to monitor the timely delivery of major projects. Ministers effectively set the high-level strategic and spending approach to the railways and ultimately are accountable for the model of delivery and operation of rail works for the country and the passengers. There were some interesting suggestions proposed for improvements to governance, and I think quite crucially, and perhaps this hasn't been conveyed clearly, so let me make it very clear, the department is completely focused on maintaining and reviewing the appropriate role for governance. If governance needs to change in order to deliver improvements, it will change. But based on the work done up until September 2014, based on the analysis done of the Network Rail Board and indeed the role of the public members, the diagnosis at the moment is that it does not need to change in order to deliver the improvements that I think we all do want to see on the railways. The honourable gentleman raised a question about the number of public members. That number, as I'm sure he knows, has been cut from 90 to 45. There was an independent external review carried out on whether or not those members were carrying out their functions effectively, and indeed it was found that they were performing their duty. So in answer to the second question, is there evidence that Network Rail governance is currently failing? I think it is right to raise the issues. I think it is a very important issue, but I think the diagnosis is that the Network Rail governance arrangements are working appropriately. I also think we need to look very carefully at the role of the public members. It could have been said in the past that public members did not have specific relevant experience in order to carry out that governance role, but they have been appointed from relevant sectors with experience in understanding corporate governance. I think the question of compensation was raised, and indeed the honourable gentleman pointed out some of the compensation arrangements that have been paid to senior managers. I'm sure, like me, he welcomes the fact that the bonuses paid in this year of Network Rail's operation will be 1/10 of those paid in the last year of the previous administration. And I think it is a question, given that the actual role of the company in carrying out its business has not changed, and as a reminder, it is a company of 35,000 individuals, it has an income statement of around £7 billion a year, and it has 38 billion of investment proposals to deliver over the next 5 years. I suppose a question for the Honourable Gentleman is what is an appropriate level of compensation in order to deliver what is a highly important piece of investment for the country, of course.
What has changed now the Network Rail has become a public sector body and its debt is on the government's balance sheet is it doesn't face the market risk of going bust, being insolvent, or it falling back on itself when its bond obligations cannot be satisfied.
Well, I think the Honourable Gentleman, like I, has a background in finances and therefore should know that investors will always have considered that debt to be effectively underwritten by the public sector. So it is simply, as a result of the EU classification, a formalisation of what I suspect savvy investors have known for many a year. So in my view, Mr Crosbie, there is no evidence that Network Rail's governance structure is inappropriate or failing. However, I suspect that the Honourable Member for Rochester's newfound interest in Network Rail governance may follow the disruption that was seen after Christmas in several mainline stations, and more recently at London Bridge Station, which many people living in his constituency use on a daily basis. And I'm incredibly grateful to him for giving me the opportunity once again to state very clearly the view of what passengers should expect. As the Secretary of State made clear at the time, the disruption at King's Cross and Paddington immediately after Christmas was totally unacceptable. In my view, the situation was inexcusable. Passengers deserve a reliable rail service, they deserve clear information, and they deserve rapid help if things go wrong. And I am sorry that in this case they did not get those things. Right across the industry, we have to be able to trust Network Rail's ability to complete vital engineering works on time. And it is absolutely essential that the lessons which have started to be spelled out in the report that he slightly introduced in discussion are learnt, and that work continues to, for example, look at when is the most appropriate time to do engineering works during the year. I will say again, and this was said last week, that over this holiday period it was the busiest engineering programme Network Rail has ever carried out. There were 2,000 work sites. Yes, briefly?
The Minister says the failures were inexcusable and then goes on to excuse the failure. She says that she's sorry for what happened. So what is she actually going to change about Network Rail governance
once
to make
again,
sure
I
that this doesn't happen again?
appreciate the Honourable Gentleman's enthusiasm for railways. It marks a rapid change in his former portfolio of interest, and I am very keen to answer the questions if he would allow me to proceed. What I was saying, Mr Chairman, was that there was an unprecedented amount of engineering work going on over the holiday period. That is because the main driver of problems on the railways are twofold. The first is we have unprecedented passenger growth. Passenger numbers now using the railways are about 1.6 billion passenger journeys a year, twice as high as they were before privatisation. The second is that the railways have been underinvested in for many a long year under successive government. The Honourable Gentleman from Rochester raised the question of London Bridge stations, as did the Honourable Member for Lewisham. That station is 176 years old. It has been frankly ignored, even though it is one of the busiest pinch points into London. And finally, that work is being done so that residents right across the south and the southeast will be able to transit in and out of London much more effectively. Of course.
Jimmy Dowd.
Firstly, to congratulate the Minister on organising a meeting, I think, next week.
Indeed.
With the train operating companies, the British train operating companies into London Bridge, Southern and South Eastern. But can she confirm that we will also have the opportunity to look at the position regarding London Bridge Station itself and the colossal debacle that my constituents and many other people's constituents have had to experience now for 10 days with little sign of their problems abating?
I agree with the Honourable Gentleman. I think that is a good adjective. I have visited the station. My officials have been down in the station. The Secretary of State was there himself during rush hour. We are extremely concerned that those fantastically overdue engineering works are delivered in a way that does not inconvenience passengers. And I think that gets to the crux of the problem. This is not a governance problem. This is a failure to work across industry with the benefits of passengers front and centre. There are clearly enormous operational improvements that will be delivered by this government's 38 billion, unprecedented amount of investment in the railways. It will benefit all members in this room, and it is long overdue. How it has to be delivered, however, is thinking first and foremost about how passengers will use the network and of the benefits for them. So I think, as we saw in the McNulty report published several years ago, the challenge for British Railways is to do as was suggested there and join up Network Rail and the train operating companies' objectives and carry on this unprecedented level of investment programme as can be done, and we know can be done across the network. I'm very happy, in conclusion, to reassure members that the government is committed right across the board to ensuring operational independence, but clearly delivery of better services for passengers in the running of the railway. And I am happy to reassure members that we are remaining committed to our huge programme of planned improvements, including the entire rebuild of Rochester Station by the end of this year and 120 million of signalling works in East Kent, which I am sure the honourable gentleman is rising to congratulate the government on providing.
I am indeed, and to congratulate.
Does the Minister give him way?
Indeed, I have.
Mark Reckless.
Yes, no, I do rise to congratulate both the government and Network Rail on the new station in Rochester. It will be fantastic. I wonder then, the Minister says that sort of working together with the operators, it would be really useful to know that new station rather closer, half a mile or so to London. The signalling changes, very significant investment there. How many minutes is that likely to knock off train times into London from Rochester, and could Network Rail and South Eastern work more closely together on planning that for the new timetable?
Minister.
I do not know the answer. I would be happy to find out and write to the honourable gentleman.